By the time the CEO's son refused to shake my hand, the deal was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. The room didn't either. They thought I was there to observe, to approve paperwork, to sit quietly at the edge of a table built by their last name. What they didn't understand was simple. Without the $2.9 billion I controlled, nothing in that room would close. And when he dismissed me in front of the board, he didn't insult me. He reclassified the capital. By the next morning, that capital was no longer theirs, and neither was the illusion of control. Whitmore Tower stood where the old brick headquarters used to be. I'd been there years ago when the founder's portrait hung in the lobby. Oil paint, stern expression, a man who built things slowly. That portrait was gone. In its place, a wall-sized digital display flashing the company's new slogan, "Accelerate boldly." The marble floors were newer, the glass cleaner, the branding sharper. But something else was gone too. Memory. 20 years ago, I sat in another boardroom like this, another charismatic executive promising growth no one could responsibly finance. 3 years later, I stood in a union hall facing retired factory workers who had just learned their pensions were gone. No yelling, no theatrics, just men and women in their late 60s recalculating whether they could afford insulin. That was the day I stopped confusing charm with stewardship. And I never made that mistake again. At the security desk, I handed over my ID. The receptionist clipped a temporary badge to my jacket. Visitor Mercer Institutional Capital. Visitor. I didn't correct it. In my portfolio were the final confirmations for $2.9 billion in institutional anchor capital money that didn't belong to me. It belonged to teachers, to firefighters, to public workers who had trusted the system to protect their retirement. I wasn't here to be impressive. I wasn't here to be included. I was here to make sure the room understood who was carrying the weight. The elevator doors closed, and I reminded myself respect is not requested. It is structured. The boardroom was already half full when I entered. Men and women in their 50s and 60s, directors who had weathered recessions. Some I recognized, some pretended not to. I took my seat quietly. Not at the head of the table, not at the end, somewhere in the middle, close enough to matter. The door opened a few minutes later. Daniel Whitmore walked in like someone who had rehearsed this day for years. It was his first major meeting since his father had formally introduced him as co-president the month before. The company newsletter had called it a generational transition. The business press called it legacy continuity. He shook hands with the senior directors first, firm, confident, measured eye contact. When he reached me, that I stood and extended my hand, and he looked at my badge. Visitor Mercer Institutional Capital. His eyes flicked back to my face, and then he smiled, not warmly. Politely, but we don't need vendor reps at the strategic table, he said. A small pause, then he added, almost lightly, this is leadership session. There it was, not confusion. Dismissal. Someone at the far end of the table let out a soft chuckle and immediately masked it with a cough. Another director said, let's stay focused, without looking at me. The CFO did not smile. I kept my hand extended. Not pleading, not offended. Just present. Daniel waited for me to correct him. I didn't. I lowered my hand slowly, on my own terms, then and returned to my seat. He moved on as if nothing had happened. Legal will handle capital sign-off, he said. Opening the merger deck. We're aligned there, across the table. I saw it, the flicker in the CFO's eyes. That was the moment. Not the insult, the assumption. Daniel wasn't trying to belittle me. He was trying to prove something. To his father, to the board, maybe to himself. He had been handed a seat at the table and was determined to show he controlled it. But he didn't understand the room. And rooms like this don't punish ego. They punish miscalculation. I folded my hands and listened. Without that money, the deal couldn't legally close. And he had just declared he didn't need the person who controlled it. Chapter 3, What He Didn't Understand. Let me explain something without turning this into a finance lecture. The $2.9 billion wasn't sitting in Whitmore's account, waiting to be spent like discretionary cash. It was waiting for recognition. Structured, protected, conditional. That money represented teachers' pensions, firefighters' retirement funds, public workers who had already lived through one executive's overconfidence. It represented people who had trusted the wrong room once before and paid for it with years they couldn't earn back. It wasn't my money. It was my responsibility. And responsibility has rules. If Whitmore Industries wanted that capital released, they had to formally recognize the authority behind it. Not socially, not symbolically, but structurally. And that wasn't ego, that was protection. Buried in the agreement between the valuation models and the closing conditions was a clause most executives skim past because it feels technical. It wasn't dramatic language. It wasn't written to intimidate anyone. It was written to prevent exactly what had happened. In simple terms, it said this: if the person legally responsible for the capital is publicly dismissed, excluded, or materially misrepresented during governance proceedings tied to the transaction, the commitment automatically moves into review, not withdrawn, not punished, reviewed. That distinction matters. Review doesn't remove money overnight. It pauses certainty. And in large transactions, certainty is oxygen. Banks don't wait for emotion to cool down. They wait for clarity. And if clarity disappears even briefly, credit tightens. Without confirmed anchor capital, the merger could not legally close. It wasn't personal. It was structural. After the meeting ended, I didn't storm out. I didn't correct Daniel in the hallway. I didn't demand an apology. I sat in my car and replayed the room. Was this pride or was it risk? If he had pulled me aside privately and clarified roles, that would have been different, but he hadn't. He had reframed the authority behind the capital in front of the board, or STA, in the very session where governance alignment was being documented, and that mattered. It mattered because rooms remember. And if a board accepts a misrepresentation in silence, that silence becomes precedent. I opened my laptop and drafted one email. Subject: notice of governance. Irregularity review. Required no emotion. No accusation. Just timestamps. Just facts. Just reference to the clause both sides had signed. Because governance isn't emotional. It's procedural. And procedure exists for the moments when confidence outruns discipline. The hotel room was quiet in the way only business hotels are quiet: thick curtains, muted lighting. The hum of distant traffic softened by glass. I set my portfolio on the desk but didn't open it. Instead, I stood by the window and watched the city lights blur into reflection. If I'm wrong, I said softly to the empty room, this will cost more than pride. Deals collapse. Jobs get affected. Headlines get written by people who weren't in the room. And even when you're right, markets don't always care. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of that. This wasn't about winning an argument. This was about pulling friction into a machine already in motion. I sat down and replayed the meeting in my head. Daniel's tone, the subtle smile at the far end of the table, the CFO's pause. Had I misread it? Had I reacted too quickly? Or had I simply refused to normalize something that would echo later? I picked up the phone and called my senior partner. He answered immediately. I saw your email. He said, do we escalate? We don't escalate, I replied. We document. A quiet pause. And convert the status, yes. Another pause longer this time. You're certain? I looked at my reflection in the window. No, I wasn't certain. Certainty is a luxury in rooms like that. Discipline is not. If we ignore this, I said quietly, that we're telling every boardroom that capital authority is ceremonial, that it's optional. He exhaled slowly. You know what that triggers? I do. Once it moves to review, the banks will react. Yes. Silence again. Then simply understood. The status shifted. Committed became conditional review. Nothing dramatic happened in that moment. No alarms, no notifications in the room around me. Just a classification change in a system designed for exactly this purpose. I turned off the lights and lay down. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt responsible, and that was enough to sleep. At 7:12 a.m., the status changed. No announcement, no headline, just a quiet update in a compliance system most people never think about. Committed to conditional review. That single shift meant one thing: the money was no longer assumed. By 8:47 a.m., the first alert reached Northbridge's risk desk. A governance review flag attached to $2.9 billion in anchor capital is not something lenders ignore. It doesn't matter how strong the projections look. If the foundation moves, the structure pauses. By 9:00 a.m., the banks noticed. By 9:03, the CFO's phone rang. We need confirmation of anchor stability, the risk officer said evenly. We've received a review notice. It's procedural. Mark Halpern replied. We're clarifying. Until it's clarified, the voice answered. Our exposure committee will suspend leverage. That was the moment the oxygen thinned. Without confirmed anchor capital, the merger couldn't legally close. Not emotionally, not reputationally. Legally. Daniel Whitmore was not in the CFO's office when that call ended. He was rehearsing a media briefing at 9:30 a.m. My phone rang. His name on the screen? There seems to be a misinterpretation, he said carefully. There was a representation. I replied. A beat of silence. You're overreacting. I'm responding. He exhaled sharply. You're putting thousands of jobs at risk over a misunderstanding. That's not what put them at risk, I said quietly. Uncertainty did. At 10:15 a.m., the formal notice came through. Bridge leverage suspended pending capital confirmation. Secondary lenders froze exposure. Underwriting partners flagged the transaction for review. Without the anchor commitment confirmed, the deal fell below its minimum closing threshold. Not collapsed, below threshold, which, in practice, is the same. Inside Whitmore's executive suite, Mark Halpern walked into Daniel's office with a tablet in his hand. We can't close, he said. Daniel looked up sharply. What do you mean we can't close the capitals in review? Daniel stood. Review isn't withdrawal. Halpern didn't raise his voice. In this market, he said quietly, it's the same. Silence. The kind that doesn't erupt. The kind that recalculates. Daniel's jaw tightened. For the first time since stepping into the boardroom the day before, he wasn't defending a position. He was realizing the weight of it. Not because I had pulled money, but because I had removed certainty. And markets, like people, do not tolerate rooms that misrepresent who holds the authority to decide. The emergency board meeting was not loud. No one slammed binders. No one raised their voice. It was controlled. Which is worse, controlled rooms don't explode. They adjust. The independent director spoke first, and his tone steady. Did you dismiss the capital signatory during session? Daniel sat upright. Jaw set. I clarified roles, he said. There was confusion about who was handling documentation. Across the table, Mark Halpern didn't soften it. You misrepresented them, the CFO said. In a recorded governance proceeding, Daniel turned slightly toward him. That's an interpretation. It's a fact, Halpern replied. And then, for the first time since the meeting began, Thomas Whitmore spoke. He had built the company over 4 decades. He rarely needed volume to command attention. He didn't look at me. He looked at his son. Did you know she was the controlling authority over the capital? He asked quietly. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. His hands were resting on the table. They trembled. Only slightly, but enough. Thomas saw it, so did I. I assumed legal would process it, Daniel said finally. That wasn't the question, Thomas replied. Another silence. He leaned back in his chair, studying his son with something deeper than anger. Disappointment carries more weight than fury. I gave you this seat, Thomas said, his voice low but steady. You were supposed to protect it. Not protect your ego, not protect your image, protect the room. Daniel swallowed. For the first time, he looked younger than his title. No one rushed to defend him. Not because they disliked him, because they understood the consequence. Thomas turned to me then. His expression wasn't hostile, it was sober. Is there a path forward, he asked. There is a path to discipline, I said evenly. Not to erasure, I wasn't there to destroy the company. I was there to correct a fracture before it widened. The independent director cleared his throat. We need to initiate a governance review. A motion was made, seconded, not unanimously at first. 2 directors resisted, arguing the response had been disproportionate, but the weight of the compliance notice, the lender reaction, the market slide those facts didn't bend, the vote passed, governance review initiated, merger suspended pending confirmation. Daniel removed from deal authority during investigation, not expelled, not publicly humiliated, corrected. The room shifted. You could feel it. From ego to survival. And in that shift, everyone finally understood what the handshake had cost. Headlines moved faster than facts. By mid-afternoon, financial networks were running banners across the bottom of their screens. Anchor capital under review. Governance dispute delays $18 billion merger. Commentators filled the gaps with speculation. Some called it fiduciary discipline, a necessary correction in a market that had grown too comfortable with legacy succession. Others called it excessive rigidity. Was this an overreaction, one analyst asked? Did one exchange justify destabilizing a transaction of this scale? The stock dropped 12% before the closing bell, not catastrophic, but sharp enough to rattle confidence. Daniel released a statement before sunset. It described the situation as procedural clarification. It emphasized continuity, resilience, and long-term strength. Markets don't react to tone, they react to doubt, and doubt had entered the bloodstream. Inside Whitmore's headquarters, the atmosphere changed. The first few days were tense. Directors met in smaller clusters. Some privately argued that the clause had been too aggressively enforced. Others questioned whether Daniel had been set up to fail. Family businesses are rarely clean. They carry pride like inheritance. Behind closed doors, not everyone agreed with the reforms being drafted. Two senior board members pushed back hard against removing Daniel from deal authority. One suggested that doing so would signal instability to competitors. The independent director responded bluntly, "What signals instability is pretending nothing happened. The governance vote passed, but not without friction, and friction leaves marks." Thomas Whitmore called me 3 days later, not from the executive suite, from his home office. His voice was quieter than it had been in the boardroom. "I built this company on relationships," he said. "Trust, personal loyalty, long memory. I didn't interrupt, but I also built it on discipline." He continued, "And I may have confused the two. There it was. Not an apology. Recognition." "Relationships require recognition," I said. "Otherwise, they become assumptions." He was silent for a moment. "I thought I was preparing him," he said finally. "I didn't realize I was shielding him." That is the risk in succession. You protect someone long enough, and they mistake protection for authority. He didn't argue. He didn't ask me to reverse the review. He understood that this wasn't about punishing his son. It was about protecting the system his son would someday inherit. And systems, unlike reputations, do not survive on loyalty alone. The emails came in waves. Some were measured and professional. Others were sharp. Half said I had protected integrity, that governance meant nothing if it bent under pressure. Half said I had destabilized jobs that in a fragile market, even a temporary review could ripple outward into layoffs, frozen hiring, stalled expansion. Neither side was entirely wrong. Late one afternoon, a junior analyst from our team stood in my doorway. She had been with us less than 2 years. Smart, careful, still learning how power moves. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated. Was it worth it? It wasn't accusatory, it was genuine. On the credenza behind my desk sat a framed photograph I kept for reasons most people in finance don't understand. It showed a group of factory workers from 2 decades ago, men and women in their 60s standing under fluorescent lights in a union hall, holding envelopes they hadn't expected to receive. The envelopes weren't bonuses, they were explanations. Their pensions had collapsed after a CEO insisted everything was under control. I looked at that photo. If discipline costs us opportunity, I said slowly, then opportunity was mispriced. She nodded, but I could see she was still thinking about it. After she left, the office felt quieter. That night, at home, the question returned. Was it worth it? 12% market drop? Public scrutiny? A succession thrown into uncertainty? I poured a glass of water and stood by the kitchen window, staring at nothing in particular. If I had ignored the dismissal, the merger likely would have closed smoothly. No headlines, no volatility, but what precedent would that have set? I didn't answer the question easily. Conviction isn't loud, it's something you test in silence. And sometimes, even when you know you acted responsibly, you still sit with the weight of what responsibility costs. 6 weeks later, governance reforms were enacted. Not smoothly, not unanimously. The headlines had faded. But inside Whitmore Industries, the adjustments were still grinding through committees and late-night calls. An independent oversight committee was formed, chaired by the same director who had first asked the uncomfortable question in the emergency session. Its mandate was simple: on paper review succession protocols, clarify capital authority recognition, and codify escalation triggers. In practice, it meant rewriting habits, and habits resist revision. 2 directors argued openly against the extent of the changes. One warned that overcorrection would signal weakness to competitors. Another suggested the board had overlearned from a single incident. But markets had not forgotten the 12% drop. Banks had not forgotten the compliance flag. Memory has leverage. Daniel was formally removed from the succession track pending governance certification and board reevaluation. It wasn't announced as a demotion. It was framed as developmental recalibration. Corporate language is often gentler than reality. Thomas retained the CEO role temporarily. Publicly, he called it continuity. Privately, it was stabilization. 6 weeks after the initial review notice, Whitmore's general counsel requested a formal meeting with Mercer Capital. No assumptions this time. Before any slide deck was opened, before any valuation models were referenced, the first item entered into the minutes was a written acknowledgement of fiduciary authority. Representation requirements. Clear, recorded, unambiguous. Daniel was not in the room. Thomas was. The oversight committee chair was. The CFO was. The tone was different. Less performance. More precision. I listened. I asked questions. I watched for posture. Not projections. When I finally signed the amended capital release agreement, it wasn't a restoration of the old structure. It was a revised one. Permanent board seat tied to anchor capital representation. Automatic escalation triggers for governance misalignment. Mandatory certification in fiduciary governance for all future executive successors. Protection, not punishment. As I closed my folder, Thomas met my eyes. This time, there was no assumption in the room, only structure. And structure, when respected, outlasts legacy. It happened without witnesses. No board members, no legal counsel, no headlines waiting to interpret the moment. Evelyn was walking toward the elevators when Daniel Whitmore stepped out of a conference room down the hall. He paused when he saw her. For a brief second, the weight of everything that had happened stood between them, not hostile, just acknowledged. He approached first, not quickly, not defensively. I asked to sit in on the oversight committee. He said, as an observer, there was no pride in the statement, only effort. Then he extended his hand. I misunderstood the room. This time, he did not look at her badge. He looked at her. Evelyn studied him quietly. Growth rarely announces itself with speeches. It shows up in posture, its intonement and humility. She took his hand. Power isn't inherited, she said. It's recognized. The elevator doors opened behind them. But before stepping inside, she added gently, and recognition starts with listening. Daniel nodded once. I'm still learning, he said. That mattered more than the apology. They entered separately. The doors closed. No applause, no victory music, just forward motion. There's a lesson here that extends far beyond boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. Respect is not about courtesy. It is about structure. It is about understanding who holds responsibility and honoring it before you're forced to. When we dismiss people based on assumption, we often misunderstand the room. And when discipline feels uncomfortable, that discomfort is usually protecting something larger than pride. And if I had stayed silent that day, no one would have known, except me. That is often where integrity lives, not in public victories, but in private decisions. If this story made you reflect on a moment where you were underestimated or where you may have underestimated someone else, I'd love to hear it. What would you have done in Daniel's position? Would you have triggered the review if you were in Evelyn's seat? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might help someone else recognize the room they're standing in. And if you value stories about accountability, legacy, and quiet strength, consider subscribing. The next story explores a different kind of power and a different kind of room. Sometimes the hardest lesson isn't learning to lead, it's learning to listen.